there was a woman being interviewed about being autistic. And as she spoke, I mean, now it's really funny because I listened back to the interview last year and I thought, it seems so neutral to me what she's saying now. But at the time, it was like these blows landing on me, this kind of absolute recognition and this sense that finally here was me. Here was somebody whose experience was so similar to mine and I'd never heard it before.
Welcome to Tilt Parenting, a podcast featuring interviews and conversations aimed at inspiring, informing, and supporting parents raising differently wired kids. I'm your host, Debbie Reber. This week, I'm grateful to have Katherine May as my guest. Katherine is a New York Times bestselling author whose titles include Wintering, The Power of Rest and Retreat in Difficult Times, and the just released in the U.S. book, The Electricity of Every Living Thing, A Woman's Walk in the Wild to Find Her Way Home. Katherine's memoir of uncovering her identity as an autistic woman, set against the backdrop of setting out to walk the 630-mile Southwest Coast Path in the United Kingdom. Katherine is also the editor of The Best Most Awful Job, an anthology of essays about motherhood. Her journalism and essays have appeared in a range of publications, including the New York Times and The Observer. I loved the voice Katherine gave to autistic women in her book, The Electricity of Every Living Thing. And during this conversation, we'll get into how Katherine navigated her journey of first self-diagnosing and then seeking out an official diagnosis and what that meant to her. We also discussed how her relationships with others changed or didn't when she shared her diagnosis, the grief that some parents experience when they realize their child is neurodivergent, as well as the importance of wintering or actively accepting periods of sadness in our lives. Before I get to our conversation, if you want to dive deeper into this episode with Katherine, please check out the show notes page on Tilt Parenting. There you'll find a bullet-pointed list of key takeaways, a transcript of the whole episode, links to all the resources mentioned, and a podcast player with the episode broken down into chapters. So if you want to go back and re-listen to a specific piece of the conversation, you can easily find it. This week's episode can be found at tiltparenting.com/session273. Thank you so much, and now here is my conversation with Katherine. Hello, Katherine. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm so looking forward to this conversation. Before I hit record, I mentioned that you are a requested guest. And when people start emailing me and say, you have to listen to this interview, you have to read this book, I pay attention. And I was really happy to learn of your work. I'd actually like to start by talking about the book that I first learned about your work through, which is called Wintering, The Power of Rest and Retreat in Difficult Times. And I heard your On Being interview with Krista Tippett, which was just a wonderful conversation. So I'd love if you could just tell us a little bit about that book and why you wrote it.
Sure, yeah. So Wintering is a book, I guess, that draws on my kind of lived neurodivergent experience, really. To talk about the times in life when we feel kind of cast out in the cold. So those fallow periods in life when we feel like, everything else is carrying on around us and we've dropped out, whether that's through mental or physical illness or through a bereavement or, something like a divorce or a big life change. They're these times that come to all of us, but we don't tend to talk about them very much. And so in Wintering, I wanted to really kind of manifest them for the world and show everyone that they had this thing in common. And also to talk about some of the gentle ways that you can endure them, I think is the best way to put that.
I think about the timing of that book, and it came out here in the States in the fall of 2020, which was a dark time for everyone, really, months into the pandemic. And I think so many people were coming to terms or learning about this term of languishing. They were experiencing sadness or ennui or things that they hadn't really ever experienced before. And then I found your book to be really comforting and almost permission, right, to be in that sadness. I'm just wondering what you heard from readers or Did you get that sense that this was really landing with people in a unique way?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much what you said, really, that people were really glad to, I guess, read a book that wasn't trying to make the best of it in a really false way. You know, that there's nothing in Wintering that says, 10 steps to winter perfectly so that you beat winter, you know. It's really not that kind of book. And it's in fact a book that talks about acknowledging your sadness, your frustration, your anger, and learning to be with it and to walk with it. And not to really think of this as something that you can win at, you know, but to instead think of it as a process that you engage with and that will come either way, you know, that it's not your fault, but also it's not something you can do the right things to avoid or beat either. I don't think we have those conversations very much in the mainstream. You know, I don't think we often allow the possibility that there are some parts of life that will come to us and they are negative and they're unavoidable. And I think that, you know, what I've really heard is this kind of rush of recognition and gratitude from people who just needed to be able to see where they were and not where they should be.
Yeah. This concept of actively accepting sadness is something that really resonates, I know, with many of my listeners. Can you talk a little bit more about that? You know, that idea of leaning into pain while not, or the sadness, but not fully giving into it in a way that could maybe be harmful.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, as someone who suffered a lot of anxiety and depression in my life, sadness is something that, you know, I spent a lot of time flinching away from and really trying to escape and thinking that it was this dark thing that visited me that, you know, was beyond my control. But I've come to see it in a different way, really, that actually sadness is a very safe emotion as long as we are able to let it in and as long as we have it in context, you know, as long as we know that we're allowed to cheer ourselves up from it, that, you know, that we're not doing anyone any disservice if we take care of ourselves within that experience of sadness. And yeah, so I think the real pain comes from that constant flinching away from sadness rather than letting ourselves feel it for a while. That's where the fear is.
Yeah. And as I was reading that too, I also related to that idea of so many listeners of this show, so many people in my community are working toward accepting and leaning into, you know, who their child is. And it's that same kind of tension, that disconnect between accepting what is and leaning into that, and that the pain can often be caused by trying to avoid or deny or not really look at what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, really, but there's so much in our culture and in the culture of parenting that, in the first place, kind of is about, you know, like seeing it as some kind of a competition, you know, and if you are doing everything right, your children will be absolutely perfect, and this is what perfect looks like, and it's this very kind of specific set of criteria. And you know, when your child doesn't match that, it can be incredibly painful, and also it can, you know, attract blame towards parents for something that is really nothing that they've done. There is a kind of grief that comes with learning that you're neurodivergent or learning that your child's neurodivergent. But that doesn't mean to say that neurodivergence is a bad thing. What we're often grieving is like this life that we imagined and the loss of it, you know, the patterning of life that we thought was going to happen. And that can take a while to shift, you know, and I think what we need are more positive representations and more just ordinary representations of what these other lives look like that have been so carefully excluded from the mainstream. And to know that there are many of us out there living a really good life, and actually quite often more conscious and contented lives than many neurotypical people are living, because they also suffer from this society that's set up to say that everything has to only be lived in one way. And I think that there's a lot to be said for that contemplative time that comes when a big change happens, and the way we're drawn away from the world for a while, and to allow that change to take place in us, and for us to really accept what we've been presented with, you know.
Yeah, I love that. And that's something I think about a lot and talk about, is this idea that our neurodivergent kids really demand that we do the deep inner work if we want to have meaningful relationships with them, support them, show up for them in the way that they need. We can't just kind of glide through and do all the usual things. We have to really lean in and do that work. And I also agree that can lead to such a more meaningful existence and connection with our kids.
When you're parenting a neurodivergent child, you don't get to just follow the kind of set pattern that everyone else is following. You know, you have to think everything through, and you have to learn different skills and different ways to do things. And that's, you know, that's a strain. Like, it's nothing to do with the child. It's just that when you're kind of breaking the patterns that are already set, it's hard work, and it's, you know, it's valid to find that difficult.
Yes, indeed. Worth it, but difficult.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, I would love to pivot and talk about your new book. And it's new in the US, I should clarify. It, I believe, came out in the UK a couple of years before Wintering did. But as we record this, it's coming out today. Listeners, it'll be available. It's called The Electricity of Every Living Thing, A Woman's Walk in the Wild to Find Her Way Home. And I was so pleased to read this book, and because I had initially reached out to you and your publishing company about Wintering. But this is the book that I think is really going to connect with so many people who are raising neurodivergent kids and who are discovering their own neurodivergence. So could you tell us what that book is about and why you wrote that?
Sure, yeah. So I wrote, you know, the whole publishing world is quite skewed. So it means that I wrote Electricity about 5 years ago, and it came out 3 years ago in the UK. And it's a book about the year that I set off to walk the Southwest Coast Path, which is in Devon and Cornwall, and Dorset in the UK, and Somerset, sorry. And along the way, I found out that I was autistic. And it's, you know, the book's really about making the connection between the two in lots of ways, about sort of walking and nature and going to places that are on the edgelands of the world, and exploring being on the edgelands of humanity. And the walk opened up space for me to really reflect on what was going on in my life, and to see the patterns that had been with me for so long, but which I'd spent a long time telling myself were things that I could overcome. And instead, I sunk into this understanding of myself as a very different kind of a person to what I thought I was. And so, yeah, the book's now coming out in the US for the first time, which is brilliant, which means it'll be available in bookstores, which is lovely, because I already have like US readers for it who've managed to get it shipped from the UK. And so it's so brilliant that this will now be in bookshops, and that, you know, maybe it will open up the opportunity for people to have the revelation that I did, because for adult women, you know, people of my age, I'm 44 now, I was 38 when I realised I was autistic. No, I was 39, sorry, I get all the ages wrong all the time. But, you know, either way, like I lived a whole life without ever coming across anything that I could have, you know, used to identify. And that meant that I spent a long time feeling like an alien, really. So I'm really hoping that it will find its way into the hands that need it now.
We'll be right back after this quick break. During this month of planning and organization for big transitions, rhythms and routines have been absolutely essential for our physical and emotional well-being. So Green Chef nights are reliably and predictably a good night. We know the ingredients will be fresh and prepped, the instructions easy to follow, and the meal delicious. We're all still talking about last week's turkey tacos with mango chimichurri sauce, refried beans, and Monterey Jack cheese. Green Chef contributes to a healthy lifestyle with easy and delicious menus like fresh seasonal salads and grain bowls. And with over 80 weekly meal and market options, plus rotating options to suit a variety of lifestyles, whether Mediterranean, plant-based, calorie-smart, keto, protein-packed, gluten-free, there are always plenty of options to choose from. Whatever you select, you'll get farm fresh ingredients, organic whole fruits and veggies, and premium proteins, all delivered straight to your door. I love those 4 words, straight to my door. Oh, and one more thing I love about Green Chef, they have an app, which means it's easy to manage meal preferences and delivery from your phone if you want to. And I, for one, want to. I am in that mode where I'm making the most of little moments like waiting in line at the pharmacy or for the F train to pull into the station to tackle all of those to-dos. So the convenience of an app is key for me. Green Chef has a special offer for Tilt listeners. Go to greenchef.com/tilt50 and use code TILT50 to get 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months. That's 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months when you use the code TILT50 at greenchef.com/tilt50. Maybe I've watched too many seasons of The Amazing Race, but every time I have to go somewhere on the subway, I treat it like a competition. It's all about making the right gut decisions about which route will get me there the fastest. Sometimes those decisions get me where I'm going early, and other times my gambles don't really pay off. Probiotics can't help with most gut decisions, but if your gut needs a little support, Ritual has your back. Their Synbiotic Plus, a 3-in-1 supplement, has clinically studied prebiotics, probiotics, and a postbiotic to support a balanced gut microbiome. I've been using Synbiotic Plus for about 6 months now, and it's become a core part of my morning routine. I take the mini capsule every morning while making my way through my inbox, whether I'm at home or I'm on the road, because it doesn't need to be refrigerated. And the capsule itself is delayed released, which helps it survive the harsh conditions of the upper GI tract for delivery to the colon, and that's exactly where we want it to go. Ritual invested in a study modeling the human colon, which showed that Synbiotic Plus significantly increased microbial diversity and the growth of beneficial bacteria. There's no more shame in your gut game. Synbiotic Plus and Ritual are here to celebrate, not hide your insides. Get 25% off your first month for a limited time at ritual.com/tilt. Start Ritual or add Synbiotic Plus to your subscription today. That's ritual.com/tilt for 25% off. As we talked about before I hit record, this is something I'm hearing from more and more people, who listen to this show and that I have communication with about their own discovery of their neurodivergence, going through an assessment with their child and saying, wait a minute, those boxes are all ticked for me. And it's really a fascinating thing for so many people. There's grief, there's joy, there is relief. I'd love if you could just take a moment to share with listeners the first time you write about this, but the first time that you thought, wait a minute, this might be me, and how that felt for you.
Yeah, so I was driving to an optician's appointment, and I was listening to the radio, and there was a woman being interviewed about being autistic. And as she spoke, I mean, now it's really funny because I listened back to the interview last year and I thought, it seems so neutral to me what she's saying now. But at the time, it was like these blows landing on me, this kind of absolute recognition and this sense that finally here was me. Here was somebody whose experience was so similar to mine and I'd never heard it before. And, like loads of people, I mean, I studied psychology at university. I worked in education for years. I'd come across the idea of autism an awful lot. And I thought I knew what it was and I didn't. And, I'd bought into all the stuff about, hardly any girls or women are autistic, all of the things that we used to be taught. And so that moment when I heard an autistic woman speak for herself, I knew right away. I mean, of course I doubted afterwards. Of course I wondered if I was right. But in that moment, I absolutely identified with her completely. And I'd never had the chance to before.
Can you talk about your process about deciding whether or not to get a formal assessment? That's something you contemplated. You wrote a quote from your book is, "What happens if my expression of autism is too delicate to be picked up and I am left somehow estranged, being no longer able to explain myself, because whatever I am, this has been a comfort for the last couple of months, knowing that I might have autism. Believe it, the more I read has made me feel like I might not be so bad after all." I just found that to be so powerful. And this conflict that you had also of when you took these tests, you talk about, should you take it as your real self or as your coping self, and the challenges that that brought up. So can you talk a little bit more about your decision to pursue a diagnosis and how you navigated that?
Yeah, and do you know what? My decision then, I'm not sure would be my decision now, interestingly, but I'll maybe get onto that. But at the time, there was so little information out there about, what it was to be an adult autistic woman. There were blog posts, there were a few people tweeting. I hooked up with other folk, that I found online. But there was really so little. And I felt like I needed to kind of pin it down, if you like. And I felt like I really needed someone else to look me in the eye and say, yes, you're allowed this. And so the book kind of finishes at point of being taken into the first stage of diagnosis with the psychiatrist. And actually after that, my diagnostic process was really, really horrible, to be honest. It was, they kind of tested me as an 8-year-old boy, including making me sit in a children's chair at a tiny table and read a children's book and explain the story. I was halfway through a PhD in narratology at the time, and I was like, "This is just a joke." But it said a lot about where we really were at the time. And since then, I thought that self-identification was valid then, and I think even more so now, because actually we're so often being assessed by people who don't understand autism and who only know how to identify it from the outside, from outside signs. And autistic women, by and large, do not present in that way. And so what we're kind of asking in the end is, do we look autistic enough for a neurotypical person to spot it? And that's actually deeply problematic for me. And I would love to see more opportunities for diagnosis that only comes from within the autistic community itself, that from autistic assessors meeting with people who think they might be autistic and meeting them in a process that lets them understand themselves rather than that judges them externally and gives them a tick or a cross. Because, as I said there, if you're left with the cross, then what are you left with? If you don't get that, if you identify with all of the aspects of being autistic and you don't get that diagnosis from somebody who may not understand autism very well, then what are you left with? Because what you needed was the permission to meet your own needs, and you should get that either way, whatever happens. And nobody gives you that right now.
Yeah, so powerful. And certainly, so you said you were 39. So this has been, maybe 5 or 6 years ago that you went through this process. And I do think that things have changed. I certainly read more and more about the self-identification, really, especially among women, being really the primary way that people are identifying as autistic. I'm just wondering, for listeners who might be in the same space and they're kind of connecting some dots for themselves, what thoughts do you have for them about whether or not it's worth pursuing, or maybe what having that identification has meant for you and what you've seen it mean for other women?
I think whatever route you pursue, and they're equally valid, I genuinely believe that it's just as valid as an adult to self-identify as it is to get a diagnosis. You have to go for the route that satisfies you. And I've always been quite anti-authoritarian. As my friend, my lovely autistic friend calls me, the snotty kind of autistic, the one that's always trying to take down authority. That's absolutely me. And so I'm naturally, not the person that's going to bow down to a psychiatrist just because they've got a degree. Well, why would I care? So, that's me. And I know that for other people, it's really important to have that external mindset kind of assessing them as well. So whichever way. But the important thing is that knowing what you are is fundamental to how you can conceptualize yourself. And everybody I know, I mean, I'm sitting here and I'm struggling to think of an exception. Every adult woman I know who has realized they're autistic has had their life positively changed by it. I don't mean it's made their life perfect. I don't mean that they found like the perfect adaptation, you know, if only those things were possible. But what I do mean is that understanding and recognition is a kind of homecoming. And if we get the right support, and if we're able to meet with our own community and to talk about ways to cope, then you can come to a different way of living your life that supports you as a neurodivergent person and is not about you fitting into a box that looks like a neurotypical person. And that is, I find it very hard to express the change that's brought about for me and for so many other people. Is just being able to make actually very tiny changes and being allowed to accept and love yourself. It's massive, and everybody deserves to feel like they belong on this earth, because that's what we're talking about. You know, when you look at the high levels of self-harm and the high suicide rates amongst autistic people, you realize that we have this fundamental problem with belonging, and that we deserve not to have a fundamental problem with belonging. We deserve to belong. And so, yeah, explore it, you know, lean into it.
Yeah. I mean, throughout the book, first of all, you know, just to take a step back, the way you structured the book is such a pleasure to read because you do really weave so beautifully. You go back and forth between your incredible. I'm looking out the window at dumping rain right now. It's horrid weather. And you write so vividly about these really intense hikes that you did. Just incredible.
Someone said to me afterwards, "You do know that nobody walks the Southwest Coast Path in winter, don't you?" And I was like, I do now.
Yeah. I mean, wow. That was, and you write about it so beautifully. And then you kind of go back and forth in your own process of discovering your autism and kind of making sense of that. And also kind of really connecting the dots of how you have lived your life up to that point and the way that you, like many autistic women, have masked and have really figured out how to just to be. And you're so good at it that it's hard to even to sometimes distill, right?
Yeah, it's nice to have a talent, isn't it? Mine is masking my autism.
Right. And, you wrote, "I sometimes feel as though social relationships are nothing more than a precarious set of plates that I have to spin, and I'm bad at it." There's so many lines in there that I know people are like, yes, that's exactly how I feel. We'll be right back after this quick break. Hey there, it's Debbie. I love making this show and sharing conversations about how to support our awesome neurodivergent kids. I've seen how even one little insight from an interview can spark a big shift in daily life. But I know that raising complex kids can be messy and lonely. And just when we think we figured it out, something comes up that boots us right back to feeling overwhelmed and stuck. That's why I've poured everything into creating a way for parents like us navigating complex parenting journeys to join together and chart a path that feels positive, hopeful, and doable. It's the brand new Differently Wired Club experience. In the club, you'll get personal support from me and other seasoned parent coaches, 6 live calls every month where you can connect and get your personal questions answered, the opportunity to learn directly from authors and experts like I have on this show, monthly themes for getting specific and tactical, an exclusive private podcast feed, and the best, most generous community of parents. Seriously, these folks show up for themselves and each other, and that right there is really everything. Because it's a daily reminder that we're not alone. Our kids aren't broken, and we have totally got this. The recently rebooted Differently Wired Club is on a brand new platform with its very own iOS and Android app. It is such a great space. However you learn, whatever your style, no matter the ages, genders, and neurodivergent profile of your children, the Differently Wired Club can help you cultivate the positive shifts you're hoping for. Join us today by going to tiltparenting.com/club. That's tiltparenting.com/club. I hope to see you on the inside.
Lynn, this time of year, parenting can be such a flusterclux.
You've come to the right place. I'm Lynn Lyons, and I've been treating anxious families for over 30 years.
I'm Lynn's sister-in-law and co-host Robin Hudson.
Join us for Flusterclux, a podcast for parents who worry.
Wait, that's everybody.
Yeah, these last few years have felt like one long anxiety attack for so many.
Why do you think parents are always surprised that a podcast about anxiety relates to them, even if no one in their house has an anxiety disorder?
Well, worry is human. Everyone does it, and anxiety shows up when we face uncertainty.
All the parenting tips you've taught me have been essential.
I love to break it down into skills we need to manage worry in our families.
We've covered so many topics: depression, burnout, meltdowns, perfectionism.
Don't forget scary mothers-in-law.
Right, but of course that's not my mother-in-law.
Because that's my mother.
And a listener.
As a psychotherapist, I like to teach parents and kids how to respond to everyday moments in healthy ways.
Managing anxiety really can be taught.
It really can. And I'll even tell you what to say.
We talk about serious stuff, but without being too serious.
Anxiety wants everything serious. Anxiety doesn't stand a chance when we're laughing, even about the tough stuff.
And just to tie back to what you said in the last response, in terms of the way that you show up now in your life, how has it changed even your daily interactions with other people? Is the need to mask lessened, or are you more just aware that you're doing it and you're in choice about that? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, because actually the thing about being a masked autistic person is that you don't get to just drop that mask, even if you want to. Like, the masking is so ingrained, it's very, very hard to get rid of, and you're not really sure who you'd be without the mask. And, you know, of course, the mask is also a privilege because it allows you to kind of pass in mainstream society. And quite often I've learned that when I drop the mask, like, because I felt like it would be the best way to meet my needs, my relationship with the people I've dropped the mask to immediately changes, and their tone changes towards me. And that feels very hurtful quite often. I think it's really important to kind of talk about that as a, you know, as a sort of baseline. I mean, for me, that's changed the kind of minutiae of my life in a really significant way. And obviously, like, it's been safest for me to drop the mask around the people I'm closest to. Not everyone has reacted really well with that, but loads of people have. And I'm learning how to unmask and to sort of state my needs, you know. And that's often shown up in really small ways, like being able to say to my husband, this music's too loud, or you've got this film on too loud and I can't cope with it. Or being able to say, like, I can't go to this event this afternoon. I'm already feeling overwhelmed and it's going to completely tip me over the edge. Or being able to say, can we go home now, please? I've reached my limit. And to be able to say that really gently without it being a crisis, you know, because in the past, and like partly because even I didn't understand what was going on, I would often have to feel like I had to reach a kind of crisis point before I got to do the thing that I needed to do. You know, like at parties, I would get completely just spooked really by all the people and the noise and the social demands, and I would end up like disappearing off to the bottom of the garden or hiding under the coats. I used to do quite a lot when I was younger. There was always a room of coats and I'd kind of bury myself under there and go to sleep. Or like getting upset. I don't need to reach those points anymore because I've dropped my mask and I've begun to own up to what I actually need. And that's, you know, that it takes a little learning. It's surprising. You don't even recognize what your needs are, first of all. And this year, for the first time, like, my dad loves to throw parties, and instead of me kind of finding an excuse not to go, you know, like saying yes and then finding an excuse not to go last minute, he issued the invitation with the words, but you might not want to go, so it's okay if you don't. And I was like, no, thank you, I don't want to go. And he was like, okay, no problem, we'd love to have you there, but we get it. And I just thought, hallelujah, you know. I felt like finally I've begun to get the message across in my own very faltering, rubbish way that actually that isn't my ideal environment. Thank you. And I love to be considered, but I love to be allowed to say no too.
That sounds like freedom.
It's so liberating, actually. And the big liberation of it is not just that I don't have to go to the damn party, it's also that somebody who loves me can see me for what I am for the first time, because I haven't always been able to own up to that without providing an explanation for it, and now I have the explanation.
Yeah. And, just to touch upon your relationship with your husband, which you write really honestly about, and you talk about how am I going to share this new information with him? And you write about how supportive he is of you and, throughout your whole journey and your goals with regards to walking the trail. And can you talk a little bit about, just sharing that information, which I imagine, even though you were married for many years and, again, for listeners who are kind of figuring this out, it's still a very vulnerable thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we'd been together for more than 20 years by the time I realised I was autistic. And that's a long time to feel like you've been undercover, I guess. And, hopefully people will discern from the book that he is just a basically decent person. And, we love each other very much, which helps. Not everybody gets that, actually. Not everyone has that privilege of having someone that loves them for who they are. But when I realised I was autistic, I got inside my head about it, because I was so worried about telling him specifically, and what would he think of me, and what would he think of his situation in that light, like what would it mean for us, and how do you break it to someone after all this time? When it came to it, he knew. I mean, he didn't know the specifics, but he knew, and he'd loved me anyway. And I think that's kind of what we forget sometimes. We autistic people spend a lot of time noticing the way that the world has rejected us, and the way that the world has pushed us away and spat us out and made us feel small. We don't often turn our attention to how we are loved and how we're valued. And it turned out that I was loved and valued for me all along, and not for the pretend person I was, because he's the person that's seen the real me the most. You can't mask all the time, and he'd seen me unmasked, and he loved me anyway, even when he found me frustrating and difficult, and of course, like, what I don't write about are the times when he's frustrating and difficult, because that would be incredibly rude of me, because it's not his book and he doesn't get to speak for himself. But that's what love is. It's not two perfect people coming together and adoring each other unquestioningly for decades. It's actually like knowing each other's difficult bits and caring anyway.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. So let me ask you one last question before we wrap up. I'm wondering, throughout the book, it's clear that you also feel conflicted about the choice that you've made to walk this trail. It's to kind of prioritize, your need or your deep desire to reach this goal, to do this thing. And your husband and your son are kind of there for you. They're often waiting for you in the village at the other end of a 12-mile walk. That feeling of sometimes feeling guilty, or is this self-indulgent, or that you're not a good enough mother, but also knowing strongly what you need in that moment. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that tension and what gave you the permission ultimately to do what you did.
Well, I mean, I think the answer to that in lots of ways, because there was definitely tension, and the autism aside, like the idea that a mother of a 3-year-old child is allowed to go and walk is a very contested idea, isn't it? We don't often get permission to lean into solitude, or to like leave our family behind, or to take contemplative space, or to go on wild missions, which is what this was. And I think one of the things that autism opens up for you sometimes is this absolute intent that you get, like when you have something in your mind that you're fascinated by and you can't let go of it, nothing much can get in the way of that. Like, there is no one so determined as an autistic person who's got a mission. And I was lucky enough to have a family who said, okay, you do that and we'll fit our way around it. And it was really hard. I mean, there are bits in the book where it shows how much conflict it brought about. And that was with me doing it in a way that tried to be as family friendly as possible, like one weekend a month. And, like within that, there's a little bit of snark as well about regular nature writing, where a man goes off on his own and journeys for months in an often kind of dangerous and isolated way and never once mentions who's looking after his children. Like I wanted to kind of externalize all of that and show how tricky it is to do that, but how necessary it was anyway. And I do think for autistic people that solitude is a basic need. It seems to be something that we need extra to the rest of the world. Like we need quiet, we need time and space to process stuff in our own way. And we can turn that into a kind of terrible, negative, disordered thing, or we can just accept it for what it is, which is a different way of interacting with the world. And we can talk about how beautiful solitude is and how having and demanding contemplative space makes everyone a little bit better, actually, because we think stuff through. And so, yeah, the book is a lot about the complex ways in which that is necessary and how we might go about achieving it.
Well, it's a wonderful book, and I'm so honored to have this conversation with you. And I really encourage listeners to check it out. Again, it's called The Electricity of Every Living Thing, A Woman's Walk in the Wild to Find Her Way Home. It is you're a beautiful writer too, as someone who reads a lot and has written a lot. The prose itself is just so delightful to read, and it's just wonderful. So congratulations. And is there anything you'd like listeners to know about, something you're working on or where they can connect with you?
I'm working on my latest book at the moment. So I've been deeply buried in that, which means it's very hard for me to turn my brain to other things right now. But you can always find me on Instagram, where I'm Katherine May _ and on Twitter, which probably I talk more about neurodiversity on Twitter than Instagram. Don't know why, it's just where all my neurodiverse peeps are. Where I'm _Katherine _May _, which looks better on paper than it sounds when you say it out loud.
Okay, great. Well, I will include links to where you guys can connect with Katherine on the show notes pages, so you can just click through. And Katherine, again, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to walk with us. Thank you so much. And yeah, we look forward to seeing what you do next.
Thank you. It's been lovely to talk to you.
You've been listening to the Tilt Parenting Podcast. If you want to dig deeper into this episode, check out the show notes page. Every episode has a dedicated show notes page on my website where you can get links to all the resources we discussed, read a transcript, and even easily go back and listen to key takeaways by using the chapters feature on the podcast player. To get to the show notes page for this episode, just go to tiltparenting.com/podcast and select this show. If you love this podcast and want to help cover the cost of its production, please consider joining my Patreon campaign. For as little as $2 a month, you can help cover the cost of the hosting platform for the show, my wonderful new editor and producer, Andrea, and more. It's so easy to sign up. Just go to patreon.com/tiltparenting to learn more, or click on the Patreon link on any show notes page. If you're into social media, you can follow Tilt Parenting at Tilt Parenting on Instagram and Twitter. Visit the Tilt Parenting page on Facebook or join my Facebook community called Tilt Together. Lastly, please help this podcast stay visible and easily found by subscribing and leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you so much. And that's all for this week. Stay safe, stay well, and take good care. And for more information, visit www.tiltparenting.com.
If you're a parent, I invite you to join us at the Mindful Mama podcast, where it's all about becoming a less irritable, more joyful parent. With sometimes hilarious and always thought-provoking experts and friends, at Mindful Mama, we know that you cannot give what you do not have. And when you have calm and peace within, then you can give it to your children. I'm Hunter Clark Fields, and I can't wait to see you there. Listen in to the Mindful Mama podcast.